Welcome to the Young Baptist Podcast, the podcast committed to the centrality of the gospel and to encouraging believers to be captivated all over again by the beauty and glory of Christ. My name is Clay Maynard. I'm joined by my co-host, Josh Johnson. What's up, Josh?
Not a lot, Clay. Just a regular old busy Thursday. What about you?
Ah, man, my life has been crazy lately, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man, I've just been running to and fro, as
Throughout
the old
the
King
whole
James
earth.
says.
Yeah.
Yeah, running to and fro and just feeling it. I've been doing a lot of traveling, some of it planned, some of it unplanned.
Right.
My wife just had somebody near to her and her family pass away, so I'm actually flying out at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning to be at a funeral for somebody in my wife's family. We got really sick, as you know,
Yep.
a week or two ago. I missed basically a week of work, and you just
And you were on
Crazy.
vacation when that all started, which is a
I
bummer.
was on basically the day I got to vacation, I got a fever, and so we drove like 7 hours to North Georgia just to sit in a cabin sick together.
Yeah. Don't you love it?
Yeah, it was.
Mhm.
And then turned around and drove home.
Yep.
Still sick.
Yeah. And those kind of drives are the worst.
Yeah.
When we came back from Texas, I was sick. It was miserable driving, 13 hours or so.
Yeah, so it's been busy, but God is still good, and I'm grateful for where I'm at.
Yeah, no, I can relate, Clay. It's been super busy around here. The last month of October, we did like Wednesday night electives at the church, and I was teaching one of those. So lots of preparation went into that. I started my first master's class, and yeah, I hope I'm a master when this is all said and done. It's kicking my butt right now, and it's only one class.
Yeah, I mean that's a good thing. Then though, that means the seminary is doing its job.
Yeah, I would say so.
For sure.
And then, yeah, just a lot coming up. Pastor Tyler's going on sabbatical. You're going out of town. Just a lot of stuff happening.
I'm going up to Virginia actually next week for the conference put on by the RFP podcast, the Crubbing Fundamentals podcast. You guys know our friends over there probably. They're hosting the For the Gospel conference, for the sake of the gospel conference. That's what it is. And so I'm going up there. I don't know. I'm supposed to sit on a panel, Josh. You were supposed to sit on a panel too, but you weren't able to make the trip. So
I just can't afford that. Like, I prefer traditional seating over panel seating. That was stupid.
No, but there's a lot going on at the church. It just kind of prevented you from being able to do it.
Yeah.
I know you got school going on, and now with pastor's sabbatical coming up. By the way, you brought up those electives.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say, if you're a church out there and you're wondering how to revamp some Wednesday night action, this was great.
Oh, yeah.
Our pastors here, Josh and Tyler, brought in two different electives that people could choose to take on Wednesday night. So the Wednesday night crowd basically split up. And so about half of them went to a class that was more practical, taught by our lead pastor, called How to Study the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So basically like a entry-level hermeneutics
Yep.
overview that was like 4 lessons. And then you did a study that was a little more theological on the Trinity. And I've gotten to hear the lessons from both of those classes, except for the one that happened last night.
Yeah.
I haven't heard the one that I wasn't in, but it was a fantastic idea, and I really feel like it got us into the deeper end of the pool than a typical Wednesday night service.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping we are able to do more of that, because I know you can't do it all the time,
Right.
but if I know that our turnout was better than typical Wednesday night services. It's kind of cool. Like, I can choose between these two classes, and I think sometimes just change is fun.
Mm-hmm.
Do something a little different. So I think it was a win here for
Yeah.
sure.
And we did some like surveys, and everything I've read so far has been, let's do this again kind of thing. So
That's awesome.
I'm all about it. Let's do it.
Well, Josh, we're talking about gospel centrality today. Specifically, we've kind of started a series on this, what it means to be gospel centered.
Right.
And the first installation of this topic we did was on gospel centered living.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to have a life shaped by, centered on the gospel? Today, we're going to advance that discussion to talk about church life. So what does it mean to be a gospel centered church? And so, I think everybody has been in churches that that they've had bad experiences in. I should say most people have had bad experiences in churches. And so it's easy to think sometimes when we go into a church that, oh, this is supposed to be some refuge from the world where I'm not going to find the kind of chaos and sin that I find out in the world. I'm not going to find unhealthiness here. I know that we sometimes assume that. It's like, oh, these people are all Christians. We all believe the gospel. This is going to be a great environment. And sometimes it's not always.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the healthiest churches are those that are centered on the gospel. But I just, on the front end, I just think it's important that we realize that churches are not just automatically healthy.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a sin-cursed world. Just before we started recording, we were just talking about how human history is a lot of chaos and a lot of sin and a lot of destruction. So we shouldn't assume that just because we walk into a building that has a steeple on the top, or whether it does or doesn't, because it says church on the sign, that we're going to be in a safe place.
Right.
If it's going to be a good place, if it's going to be a healthy place, and if it's going to be one that truly represents the God we serve and points people to Jesus, it's going to be because we did it on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Healthy cultures don't just happen. And if you've even working jobs, you know this is true. If you've worked jobs where there was problems, you've had better jobs than others, maybe, healthiness doesn't happen by accident. And it's no different in the church. So if we're going to be a church that truly focuses on the gospel, we're going to have to do it on purpose.
Yeah. And that's true of everything. I mean, you can't expect yourself to live a healthy lifestyle without intentionality. That's going to bleed over into the church too, because we are dealing with human people, like you said. And if there's no purpose, if there's no intentionality, it ain't going to happen. Just period.
Absolutely. Josh, on this topic of gospel centrality, you'll hear one of the criticisms I've heard of it is, oh, you'll even hear people say this. Oh, all you want to talk about is the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when they say that, what they mean is they assume that when we say we want to talk about the gospel and we want that to be the main thing, and we always want to come back to that, I think they may sometimes assume that what we mean by that is all we're going to talk about is how to be saved.
And we've heard about places that's what they do a lot.
Yeah, you mean they only talk about how to be saved?
Yes.
Okay.
Where
yeah.
they focus, like, take their Sunday morning on just preaching the gospel as far as the death, burial, resurrection of Christ, and a call for repentance and faith every single week. And it ignores the fact that there are believers there growing that make up the majority of the congregation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think in a way that's a fair criticism. I think it's a misunderstanding, but I think it's a fair criticism in a way.
Yeah. If what you mean by gospel centered or focused primarily on the gospel is that you only preach how to find justification through faith, then yes, I would agree with you that's myopic
mm-hmm.
to focus to only talk about that. But if what you mean by the gospel centered is what we mean, which is that the gospel is not just the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That's the gospel story. But what the gospel entails, the gospel is not just one thing. It's actually a lens through which you see everything,
mm-hmm.
and it impacts everything about your church. If you realize that, then the gospel you can be a one issue church in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
That our focus is on the gospel. So I know Christians tend to be one issue anyway. I know that it's a temptation for everybody to get off, to focus on one thing and to be that one issue Christian who, if I'm not coming to meet with our church and I'm not hearing teaching and preaching regularly on my issue, I'm upset and I'm wondering why I'm not hearing about it
mm-hmm.
enough, because that's all I want to talk about or think about. We all have that friend on Facebook. All they do is post about like the blood moons in Israel and all they want to talk about or think about is the end times, right?
Well, and we saw this fleshed out during the pandemic, especially during the election cycles. There's articles you can read on it that if people didn't feel like their own political persuasions were talked about enough, they literally left churches.
Leave churches, yeah.
Over those kind of things.
Yeah, if you wanted your people to wear masks, maybe I left because, oh, you're one of those people, or if you didn't require masks,
mm-hmm.
there were other people who were mad about that, or if you shut your doors or if you didn't shut your doors, then you either were a liberal or you didn't care about people's lives or whatever. It was any other thing. And by the way, I believe the devil is perfectly happy with anything else being the focus of the church.
Oh yeah.
I fully believe that, even if it's a biblical topic, even if it's a topic that can be found, there's information on it in the Bible. If it's not supposed to be the main thing, then we can't get sidetracked and make it the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think within the last few years, I feel like those topics move even faster than they ever have. Like CRT became a big thing, where I see people on social media and I see people writing blog posts basically talking about, if you're not preaching against the CRT social gospel, then you're going to lose, you're going to lose the next generation and all this kind of, it's the greatest threat to the gospel. People would say stuff like that. And I'm baffled by that.
Well, it's such a shallow view of the gospel.
Right. There is actually no threat to the gospel.
Yeah.
Jesus' kingdom marches on. I'm not saying that there's not truth to be learned by studying these things, and that there isn't real dangers possibly out there. I know that there's a lot of Christians who think it's easy to not realize you're a one issue Christian and still be a one issue Christian. I got my little soapbox. And then there's even people, I think that they tend to be very divisive people, but the soapbox changes every year or two. They're talking about this year, and then they're talking about something else next year.
Right.
And usually those things are never the gospel. The gospel never ends up becoming the focus. It's always this revolving door of issues
Mm-hmm.
that they want to fight about, essentially. And I think that's probably the biggest commonality, is that it's divisive and there's a lot of fighting that goes into that. Because I think maybe is there anything that the church can be focused on that doesn't lead to division at some point down the line? Probably. That's an interesting thought. It probably all at some level will lead to divisiveness.
Well, I mean, even the gospel does.
That's true.
If you think about it. That's a good question.
I guess the question would be, is it the kind of division that needs to take place because over the truth, or is it the kind of division that's a waste of time because it's a distraction?
It's a more of a healthy division, I would think.
Yeah.
I never thought about that. I guess there really isn't any sort of an issue that a church could face that wouldn't cause some sort of a division in some way.
Yeah.
Healthy or unhealthy.
Right. Yeah, because we've had people leave this church because of our focus.
Yeah.
They didn't appreciate the focus that we had here. And they're God's children. He'll take care of them. I'm not worried about them, but we weren't going to alter our focus here.
No. Yeah.
Yeah. Tim Keller says, because the gospel is endlessly rich, it can handle the burden of being the one main thing of a church.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's the only thing that can be the one main thing of a church and handle it properly. So, Josh, what is a gospel-centered church? What could I look for? What am I wanting to see if I'm a leader in a church, or if I'm just even a member at a church? I want to be a part of a gospel-centered church. What do we see? You brought up something that Ray Ortlund used, sort of 3 words, and I think we're going to sort of drill down on this. But let's start with this. I think a gospel-centered church has to first care about the purity of the gospel.
Yes, 100%. I mean, if you don't get it right, you've got nothing to stand on.
Yeah, it can't be a false gospel. And this just means that we actually care about doctrinal purity in the gospel.
Yes.
We're not going to be milquetoast about, or sheepish or shy about saying that we preach the gospel according to the scriptures, or it's not worth standing on, it's not worth defending. And corruptions of the gospel are all around us. We could spend a whole episode talking about we could do a whole season on the various disruptions and corruptions of the gospel that are out there. There's people that attack the deity of Christ. There's people that second guess the blood atonement.
Right.
There's all kinds of ways to not take seriously the purity of the gospel. You can't actually be gospel-centered if you don't care about the purity of the gospel. So that's going to rub some people the wrong way.
Well, you're going to struggle to even really be a sound church if you don't care about the purity of the gospel. And if orthodoxy isn't anything important to you, then you're going to end up going down the wrong path anyways, and you're building a faulty foundation there.
Well, a lot of these guys, we were just talking about these one issue Christians who go from thing to thing or have their particular soapbox. A lot of those guys end up corrupting the gospel by trying to cudgel the gospel into their issue. And so that can be a corruption of the gospel in a way by making it about some issue. And in other words, if you actually believe the gospel, you're doing what I think you should do in this area. So they sort of try to pigeonhole it like that. But we can't do that.
Say that if we take the gospel and then we try to add something onto it and do something in addition to it, we're going to end up diminishing some of the potential, if you will, gospel power in the ministry.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because we've hitched something to its wagon. It's an agenda that we've hitched to the wagon of the gospel, and all it's going to do is rob it of its power because it's not the gospel that was delivered by the apostles. If the apostles weren't preaching in the first century, then it's not essential to the gospel.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, what does Romans 1 say? The gospel is the power of God. We start ladling it down with all of our stuff, and we're just going to confuse people, and we're going to be compromising the purity of the gospel message.
Yeah. I think the gospel has one primary agenda, and that's the glory of God and his kingdom being built. And if we try to build our own kingdoms into that, then we're going to miss it. We're going to end up, I won't say we're going to screw the gospel up because we can't do that, but we'll damage our churches deeply.
Yep. And hurt our own effectiveness and live distracted lives.
Yep.
Now we have to care about the purity of the gospel. Josh, you mentioned that the gospel should be the driving force of the church, not just an add-on. You just spoke of hitching something to the wagon of the gospel. We do that long enough, before you know it, we've reversed, and now the cart's
before the horse.
Yeah, now the gospel's the cart.
Yeah,
or I should say, yeah, the gospel's the cart being drugged by whatever else is actually more important to us.
And I think that takes intentionality again, where we're talking about that, because we have our things, we have our specialties, if you will, and we have to examine those things and choose to do those things based upon gospel effectiveness instead of just pragmatic effectiveness. Like, is this driving the mission, or is it just, this is one of our things that we do? And after a while, and this is why I think churches have so many like golden cows, because they become those things that this is just what we do, instead of asking the question, how does this fit into actual gospel ministry, and applying the gospel to those things.
Yeah, what we do is we have the songs that we like on Sunday morning, and then the preacher brings the sermon that we've hired him to bring. And then we have potlucks on these days, and it turns into this social club where we also preach the Bible while we're here. And it's really about our little kingdom.
Yeah.
Our little system. And it can be even, we talked about issues already, but I know within the last few years, I know people who've told me that they have sensed that their churches were in diverse contexts where they weren't doing a very good job of reaching a diverse audience. And so they started talking in their church more about, things like racial reconciliation, like, hey, we live in a divided city, a very divisive city. What are we doing to be agents of reconciliation across all the lines that the gospel crosses throughout the New Testament? Well, that's a good thing. That's a wonderful thing for a church to be having that kind of reflection about. Like, hey, are we too content not reaching certain people when we should be trying to reach everyone, every nation, every people, every tribe? And that's a wonderful thing. But then you can become too focused on that. You can be so focused on that to you, that's the gospel. The gospel is now about inclusion and diversity.
Right.
No, it's not. The gospel certainly will have that effect, right? We know in Revelations 5, those gathered around the throne are from every kindred, type, tribe, and tongue. So that is an effect of the gospel. But, and then there was even those who saw people doing that and got mad at them for it. And so their whole thing became yelling at people for doing that. And so it just, again, these are distractions, and they will, I do believe you focus on it long enough, it takes over the main stage.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're sinners, and because we can the truth is we can get glory by being distracted to any other thing.
Mhm.
We can make ourselves the focus the moment we make it about something else. If we're actually focusing on Christ and God's glory in the gospel, that's a self-sacrificing thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think churches who are doing a really good job of it can get distracted and have to sort of refocus and be like, you know what? No, this is not the main thing. We've talked about this, but we're not going to make this the main thing.
And I think something else that could potentially be dangerous is initially beginning on a path that might be more social or, let's just go that way, social oriented, and seeing great gospel success in that, and then not being willing to step back over time and reevaluate and say, okay, are we still doing this because this is moving gospel ministry forward, or are we doing this because this has worked for so long?
Yeah. Are we off track?
Yeah. And I think sometimes those things end up becoming, and churches can end up becoming, say, social platforms where Jesus gets invited instead of being
Absolutely.
Christ-centered, which is what we're driving at today.
So the gospel's the driving force, not an add-on. And I think the last thing we have here is that, and this is where we use Ray Ortland's rubric here, is that the church should strive for a culture that represents the gospel.
Mhm.
And we've touched on this already, but let's drill in a little bit. So the church has to care about the purity of the gospel. In other words, it has to be doctrinally pure, but it also has to represent the gospel in the way that the culture operates, the way that we live.
Yeah.
It has to be both. And churches tend to usually probably do one or the other well and struggle with the other one. I don't know. It's possible, but I know that I've been in churches that did one well, struggled with the other one.
Mhm.
They were great about preaching the purity of the gospel, but they were not so good about living a culture that represents the gospel well.
Yeah.
So we've got some notes here. Let's go through them. What is a church that strives for a culture that represents the gospel? What does it look like?
Well, Ortland's formula is basically gospel plus safety plus time. So let's just break those down.
Sure. So gospel. So this is what? This is the exposure and application of the gospel to our
Mhm.
life.
Yep.
This is being consistently reminded of, consistently proclaiming, and living in the light of what Jesus has accomplished for us.
Mhm.
There's a lot of ways to do this, but it's important that a church is doing it.
Yes.
If our culture is going to represent a gospel-centered culture, and it's going to represent the gospel well, we have to be exposing people over and over again in intentional ways and applying the gospel's truths to our lives. We've recently, I know at our church, started doing more communion. Was that this year we started doing it?
Mhm.
We started doing it once a month. And I'm not saying you have to do it once a month, but I have appreciated the increased focus on communion. Because what is the table? What is the Lord's Supper? It is a reminder of what Christ has accomplished for us.
Mhm.
It's his broken body. It's his blood that's been shed. That has increased, I think, in our church, our awareness on an ongoing basis of the gospel
Mhm.
in a very healthy way. So this is something we all have to ask. Are we doing a good enough job returning to the gospel and exposing ourselves over and over again and applying it to the gospel's truths to our lives? I think you can find gospel application in almost every sermon.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the truth is it's you can always go back to the finished work of Christ. If nothing else, as the motivation in any sermon. I can preach a message on almost anything, and I can at the end return to the gospel's truths for the power to do what is right in this area, the motivation, and we're looking to Jesus, who himself went before us and said, "Follow in my steps." So if I'm preaching on the tongue, I can go back to Jesus, the centrality of who Jesus was and what he accomplished for us. If nothing else, than to say, hey, once we've been changed by the power of the gospel and forgiven for the way we've used our tongues, we can look to Jesus. And how did he speak?
Yeah.
And he went before us and he gave his life so that we could be forgiven for the way we used our tongues. You know, like it's so easy to make the focus of preaching the gospel.
Yeah. But it requires work and intentionality.
That's true.
You can't just commit to, if gospel doctrine is going to be a priority, then you have to dig deep.
Yeah.
And that's not just the pastor, that's everyone. you have to be willing to dig deep and mine that out of the scripture and I don't want to say find it as if it's hidden, but do the work that's required to draw
those applications
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the exposure, there's gospel is the first thing that Ortlund mentions. And then he mentions safety.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great word.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting how this looks in a church. What does it look like for a church to be a safe place?
I think something that it's not supposed to be a safe place for sin. In fact, sinfulness and hidden sin should cause people consternation in a real gospel-centered place, knowing that their sin is not going to be, it's going to be exposed in the light of the gospel. That's what the gospel does, is it exposes sin. And so there shouldn't be a sense, in the sense of like, I can just hide this away and I'll be okay. The safety is found in saying, I have this sin, and there's safety here to say, I have this sin. And I don't think we've seen a lot of that, at least in our circles in particular. There's been more of a facade building, covering up of sin. Don't kind of like, we'll preach at sin, but if it really actually practically comes up, we're not going to necessarily do much about it. In a gospel culture, it's not that sin is welcomed, but it's welcomed in the sense of, okay, you're safe. This is a safe place for you to admit and to be honest and to say, I'm a sinner and I need help. And that's what the church should be.
As you're talking about that, something just occurred to me that I've not really thought of before. Churches that a gospel-centered church doesn't make sin safe, but it does make sinners safe.
Yeah.
And if a sinner feels safe to be honest about sin in the church, it's safe for the sinner, but not for the sin, because the sin's going to get dealt with. But what's weird, Josh, is the reverse is also true. If sinners don't feel safe, that actually makes the sin safer. Because if the sinner doesn't feel safe in a gospel, if the sinner's not in a gospel-centered church and he doesn't feel safe to be honest, it actually hides the sin and makes the sin more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So the sin is where the sinner is truly safe and he feels the ability to be honest. The sin is not safe at all.
Right.
Because now in a community that's shaped by the gospel, that can be dealt with. Whereas if the sinner doesn't feel safe, there's not going to be grace for them.
Mm-hmm.
There's not going to be safety in the church. They actually will probably hide the sin, and it makes the sin more safe because it's going to grow and metastasize in the darkness.
And this is not to say that in a gospel culture, sin should not be called out because we're trying to develop safety. I think the opposite is true. It should be called out, knowing that in that culture, there is freedom, there is openness and potential for confession and repentance.
Safety just means, what safety means is that you're part of the family. You don't lose your place because you're a sinner. And it's not the end. The gospel actually gives you the confidence to face your sin without being destroyed by it.
Mm-hmm.
I can now be honest about who I am because I'm a child of God. I'm not defined by the sin anymore. So even though I'm still plagued by it, Jesus has died for me and redeemed me, and he says who I am. And now I can, if I go to a church and I'm exhibiting some serious issues that are causing problems and somebody approaches me about it, I actually should be able to have the humility to accept it and not fall into a pity party about it, because it's not the end. This is part of dealing with a sinful nature. And because of the gospel, I have the confidence to say, I'm going to face this. Thank you. And truly be grateful for it.
And to the one that's not a believer, being in a safe environment and hearing even honesty about sin helps them know, okay, I'm accepted here, not what I've done, but who I am. And, I can learn more about the grace and truth and love of Christ here and confess and repent of my sin and begin a relationship with God.
Yeah, the truth is too, an outsider would probably be shocked if they saw more church environments where there was such honesty happening.
Mm-hmm.
They would feel safe automatically because they would see that other people are willing to be honest about the areas of their life they're broken. And that would be such a clarion call probably to even outsiders who come in and see, and they're thinking like, man, where do these people come from? And where do they get off just being so honest about the fact that they fall short and the encouragement and the love that they experience from each other to strive for pleasing God, in spite of the failures they've had.
And this might be the biggest indictment against the church in America, is that we've built this reputation where people are like, well, if they're not familiar with the church or they're not saved, you hear things like, well, I don't know if I'd be welcome there, or, well, I don't wear the right things, or fill in the blank with any number of excuses that you've heard from people who are unsaved about why they haven't come to the church. Well, that's not their fault. I think that falls on the church for not having developed a safe place for sinners to come in and just be honest that they're sinners and admit, yeah, I sin.
Yep. And well, the truth is, it's just, they end up finding out too, it's just hypocrisy.
Mhm.
We're all sinners anyway. So if we're hiding it, we're just doing a good job. We've just figured out how to do a good job of hiding it. It's not that we're not doing it. We're just not being honest about it. I actually ran across this quote a little while back. David Kinnaman says this. He said, "What are Christians known for? Outsiders think our moralizing, our condemnations, and our attempts to draw boundaries around everything. Even if these standards are accurate and biblical, they seem to be, to the outsiders, all we have to offer. And our lives are oftentimes a poor advertisement for the standards. We have set the game board to register lifestyle points. Then we're surprised to be trapped by our own mistakes. The truth is, we've invited the hypocrite image."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think gospel cultures in a church has to fight that. Ortlund uses the word safety here. We've got a few words. You should see grace. You should see honesty. You should see accountability. And we've talked about all three of those.
Mm-hmm.
You should also see hospitality and compassion. And that is what I think outsiders should do. We should do a better job of making sure outsiders understand, actually feel that.
Mm-hmm.
And if an outsider comes in and tells you something about your church culture, hey, I felt this way, man, listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
What did they experience? They have no reason to lie to you. They're going to tell you what they experienced there. And so if you get markers of what people are experiencing when they come into your assembly, take note of that.
Yep.
They should feel, because we have been redeemed by pure grace, I'm in no position to be unwelcoming to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in no position to look down at anybody who comes into one of our services. And they should feel that. If I'm truly welcoming and I'm truly showing them the love of God that I've been given freely, then they should feel that hospitality and that compassion.
And people aren't stupid.
Yes.
You can fake it all you want, but people aren't stupid.
That's right.
They can see right through that kind of stuff.
We might be good at faking, but we're not that good.
Yeah.
We sometimes think we're good at it.
Mm-hmm.
People they're going to feel it, whatever's actually true.
It's true.
Which brings us to this last thing that Ray Ortlund mentions here. He says, gospel, safety, and time.
Mm-hmm.
Man, what a wise observation. That gospel culture takes time. And a church shaped by the gospel takes time. And people changed by the gospel takes time.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it look like to give time? It means that we are encouraging growth.
Yep.
It means that there should be people in a good church at various stages of their Christian life, but moving in the same direction,
Mm-hmm.
right? I've heard somebody call it a long obedience in the same direction.
Yep.
Gospel-centered churches should be patient with those around us. We should be able to love one another through the process, even through some of the sinful parts and even through some of the ugly parts.
Yes, because we have to acknowledge that that we are even in process. We're still in sanctification.
Yeah.
And think we expect people to be where we're at immediately. And that's unfair and that's not gracious. That's not going back to safe. That's really not creating a safe environment for gospel growth. That's kind of a hostile place to be.
Well, and we talked, the first point was about exposing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there the need for the repeated exposures? Because we don't get it right away.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times do you tell a kid no on the same thing?
Right.
We don't really get better at that necessarily as we get older. We don't get things right away. things have to be repeated to us over and over again. That's why we have repetition.
Mhm.
If you're in a field, any field that requires any level of experience or credentials, that there was places all along the way where you had to memorize things, you had to learn things, you learned little acronyms, you had flashcards, you whatever. Why? Because these were these fundamental things you needed to know in order to understand this whatever science or job or whatever you're doing. And this is true in a church. If we're going to have a culture shaped by the gospel, it's going to take time, and we're going to have to work toward it.
Do you think sometimes we're so unwilling to grant people time in the church is because of all the things in our lives? The gospel and Christianity is so incredibly high stakes. It's so incredibly important. And so we think there should be like some insane sense of urgency behind it.
Yeah, I just told you. You got it?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you got this now, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that is part of it. Like, hey, we're talking about, hey, I really need you to figure out how to be a better parent. You're raising these kids. They're having this experience right now. You're going to ruin them. What's the matter with you?
Mhm.
Do what I said. That kind of attitude, you think, like this mentality that we need to make the change right now. But that doesn't work. Hasn't worked with any of us that way.
In any realm.
No, we don't change overnight. And even supernatural change, God works in us. Philippians 1, he says he's begun the good work in us and he will complete the good work in us at the day of Jesus Christ. So really, this is maybe an important part. It isn't. He used the word time here. It's so important because it doesn't happen automatically. It's actually not it's not exhaustive at any point in our life. There's never a point in our life where we're like, we did it. We're at the destination. We made it.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work that way. Philippians 1:6 says Jesus completes it at the day of Jesus Christ. That's going to be the day where we're finally whole. And we're supposed to be in devotion and in sanctification all the way up until that point. But it's just a process, and it's a journey that we're all on. The other thing, Josh, I think is the reason we do it is you mentioned because it's urgent and this truth is so important, but probably too because it makes us feel good if there's something we're better at than somebody else.
Oh yeah.
So it's easy. It's kind of fun to point that out. Maybe like, hey, I'm so much farther along than they are in this area. But we often don't factor in that we often didn't start at the same place as other people.
Yeah.
God, I came from a different place than somebody else did. They might have actually come further than me. But yeah, having this understanding of time, I'm not going to get there. Fellowship Baptist Church, where we serve, is not going to get there next week,
right,
or next month, or next year. Next year, hopefully, we'll be a healthier church than we are today, and a growing church, and doing a good job of proclaiming God's glory and gospel. And the goal is to be further than we are today. But we're not going to be there. We're not going to be at the destination. We're still going to be in process. We're still going to be in God's hands, I should say.
Yeah. It occurs to me that this is exactly how Jesus in his relationship with his disciples was. There was gospel doctrine. He was teaching them. There was safety. How many times do we see the disciples talking to Jesus and asking questions?
Yes. Or failing, outright failing,
like
falling
just
short.
Look at Peter. And then we see time. All the way up until before even Jesus left, he was dealing with Peter over and over and over again. And what did Jesus never do? He never cast any of them out.
Nope.
He never got mad. He never was like, you guys are a bunch of idiots.
Yeah.
We don't see anything like that. We see grace on repeat with Jesus and his disciples.
Yeah. Speaking the truth to them, reminding them of what they needed to know, and showing them grace. Peter is one of the great. There's a lot of examples of this in the Gospels, but one, maybe my favorite, was when Jesus tells them, after he rises from the dead, he tells them to go tell the disciples
and Peter.
And the first person I actually heard talk about this, I'm not the biggest fan of him. Well, maybe I'll just leave his name out.
Yeah,
it's a famous author. It's a famous author that let me put it this way. I like some of what he says, and I don't like other things he says, but God bless him. He's done. And the truth is, he wrote some stuff that really helped me at a time in my life. But in one of his books, he pointed out that Peter had just denied Jesus. And the Bible says that he goes out and he weeps bitterly.
Mhm.
You know, he was essentially feeling like, maybe I'm done. You know, I think I might actually be done. I don't think I'm really worth being one of Jesus's disciples. And he goes back to fishing.
Mhm.
I mean, let's go back to work. And Jesus sends for him and he says, tell the disciples to come. And he says to tell the disciples and Peter, almost as if to say, in case Peter hears the disciples and says, yeah, he doesn't mean me, I want Peter to know I mean him too. I'm not done with him.
Yeah, that's good.
And man, maybe you're listening and you haven't been giving yourself time. Maybe you woke up today and you said, again, I committed this sin again. I fell short in this way today. I've been saved for 10 years now.
Mhm.
I've been fighting with this sin for 20 years. I do the best I can. I strive. I'm in church. I read my Bible. I know that God has sanctified me in so many ways. What is the matter with me?
Mhm.
And my encouragement to you is God's not done with you either.
Yeah.
So if you say something you shouldn't say, or you go someplace you shouldn't go, or you think something you shouldn't think, and you wonder, why would God fool with me anymore? Just remember, your God is not done with you yet.
Yeah.
You are not a completed project.
Mhm.
And one day, you will never say the things you shouldn't say. You'll never do the things you shouldn't do, because God will have completed you.
Yeah.
You'll be finished. But that day is not yet.
And it won't be here on this earth.
That's right.
Anything else, Clay?
That's it, man.
There it is. There it is. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Young Baptist Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, we'd love to hear from you. You can connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Young Baptist Pod. Also, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating and review wherever you consume the content. Be sure to check out our website, theyoungbaptistpodcast.com, for more resource recommendations and to join our YBP community.